I witnessed her true form. She has chosen me. A terrible tragedy cuts into her power. But with each soul harvested by her slayers, she heals. She returns closer to her true self. With her power, we too will grow. This is her promise.
Release your fear and be reborn!
Welcome, brave adventurers, to the Sanctum of Rebirth, the ancient temple built in the distant past for the mysterious goddess of the desert, Amascut. In this sanctum, the souls of the mortals of our world will be judged and potentially gifted a second chance in our world to live their lives. But I must warn you, adventurer, after plundering this ancient temple, I believe that the purpose here is for something far more sinister. The Sanctum of Rebirth, released on the 22nd of July 2024, is a PvM encounter similar to the Elite Dungeons, and like the Elite Dungeons, it contains many lore and gameplay implications. To start off, the player is made aware of the Sanctum looming off the coast of the underworld city of similar to Raseal's citadel. But why was it here? A suspicious stranger aids you in finding a way to the Sanctum, where you meet up with the desert god of the dead, Icthlarin. Icthlarin quickly fills us in on the nature of the Sanctum. He tells us that it is the domain of his sister, and it is for souls not ready to leave the realm of the living that would be brought there to be judged, and that now it is home to creatures of the Devourer and those that are cursed to enact her will. So basically, to sum it up, the Sanctum of Rebirth is where the Mennephite Pantheon take the souls of their followers to be judged for the afterlife. But who is Amascut? And more importantly, perhaps, who corrupted her?
Hello friends, I am Tuslaya, and I'm here to tell you about the mysterious and powerful goddess Amascut. Many thousands of years ago, the powerful god Tumikin and his wife Eldinis wished to live as mortals do and longed to have children of their own. They imbued their pet cat and dog with divine energy to make Icthlarin the dog became god of death for the Menephites, and Amascut the cat became goddess of rebirth for her pantheon. While her brother shepherded the dead to their final destination, it was Amascut's job to judge their sins and decide the final destination of their souls. In the Second Age, the Mennephite pantheon found himself in a war with invaders from another realm. The dark god Zaros had arrived in Gilnor and sought to claim this land as his divine birthright. In an attempt to stop these invaders, Amascut and her brother went in search of powerful beings to aid them in the defense of their homeland. As fate would have it, they stumbled upon the very world Zaros was from, Runescape, and discovered the Majrat, a tribe of villainous, bloodthirsty divine beings who craved war and conquest. Icthlarin knew these beings were perfect to aid them in their war with Zaros. But his sister was horrified at the barbaric nature of the Majrat and fled to the nearby volcano, the dwelling place of the corrupted elder god Ma. It was here that some unknown force corrupted Amascut, driving her insane and turning her into the Devourer. Well, you may be asking, what corrupted Amascut? We know from the Majra de Zandra that Ma was corrupted by a black stone used for necromancy. Wouldn't this same force naturally be what corrupted Amascut?
On the recent roadmap reveal, we got a lot more information about the plot of the Sanctum storyline. It was confirmed that the next story quest, Ode to the Devourer, will be a direct sequel to the Requiem for a Dragon quest. In Requiem, we find out the source of Vorkath's corruption, a small black stone shard that the evil dragonkin Zorgoth placed inside of Vorkath in order to corrupt his essence. This material is the same as the item dropped by the ambassador called Black Stone Hearts. You can even use this item on Vorkath post-quest for extra dialogue. This blackstone material, known as Kreoth Takla in the Dragonkin language, is described as a living, resonating material used as a conduit for necromancy, corruption, and can also be used to warp the fabric of space and time to create portals. But what if I told you that Amascut created and taught the citizens of Runescape the Slayer skill as part of a plot to gather souls on a grand scale, and her slayers happen to use this very black stone material to make themselves stronger while practicing Slayer? That would be quite the coincidence, right? The Black Mask is one of the most iconic items in all of RuneScape, and you obtain this item on the island of Mosley Harmless from Cave Horrors. But what are these Cave Horrors? They are actually a Slayer creature, which you have to have 58 Slayer to defeat, and they drop the Black Mask. To most people, this is really the end of speculation or knowledge on this creature, but they're actually called the Moanu, and they are from the same planet as monkeys and apes. Interestingly enough, they have an entire backstory and lore that is incredibly detailed, but to sum it up, on their home planet of German, a being called Tezcatlipoca reached its hand across the world and pricked its finger on a mountain where its blood ran, creating the Moanu, the monkeys and apes, and it commanded them to fight in order to entertain it and shed blood in its honor. At some point, Tezcatlipoca also reaches its hand out of a lake and offers to bring the Moanu to a new world in order to shed blood and spread its horror. This world that it ultimately led them to was Runescape. There are 3 distinct types of Moanu on Gelinor. You have the Jungle Horror, the Cave Horror, and the Sea Horror. The Sea Horrors are also at ED3, or the Shadow Reef. This is where the ambassador is, who drops the item, the Blackstone Heart, that we mentioned earlier. What's ironic about all of this is that the location of these horrors is incredibly close to where Menaphos is, meaning that since one of these types can easily traverse the water, that there's virtually no way that there was no contact between these beings, which is another really interesting connection to make. And with the Slayer skill being required in order to access these beings, and them dropping an item that makes you better at the Slayer skill, it definitely feels like there's an obvious connection. But wait, there's more. What if I told you that this being Tezcatlipoca with black stone hands had another name? Well, let me read you something. What I'm about to share with you is a passage of the Strange Tribes book, written by Maud Raven, and written in-game by Herbert Dunwich while he was studying the Moanu tribes. Quote, "Each of these figurines was placed around a larger sculpture. At first, I believed that this was simply a decorative stand, but over time I began to realize that it is more than that. The final figure is carved from that same black stone, but is nothing but a writhing mass of grasping hands clawing their way out of the pool in which it rests. I believe this to be their central deity, the chief god from which all the others pledge their fealty. A terrible thing. Something about it inspired a primordial dread I could not rid myself of. They called it Tezcatlipoca, but I somehow know that is not its name. I fear that I know the name somehow, like an infection of language seeping into my soul from some other place. I dare not write the name, lest you, dear reader, become similarly infected. I really want to protect you, dear reader, from this horror, but then I wonder, do I really think I can save you? The being described in this text is my favorite thing to discuss on this channel, but if you are new here, Zao Tak is the name of the being that the author alludes to. It is stronger than the Elder Gods, but from another reality, and like in this lore book, it wishes to claw its way out of the universe in which it resides. The ambassador that we mentioned earlier has black stone inside of him, and he attempted to summon Zao Tak by gathering souls with the help of Oreb the Magister, someone who wields magic similar to that of Amascut. Oreb even shows up at the Shadow Reef to help with this ritual to summon Zaltok, as well as many other Menethite warriors. We find out that in the Sanctum Lore, Amascut has a terrible tragedy that cuts into her power, and I believe that this is a direct reference to the Black Stone, as in the Shadow Reef lore, Oreb the Magister describes the ambassador's soul as a void unable to be reformed now that it was occupied by Black Stone. But we also know that Zaltok is hungry for the souls of every living being, hence the Devourer's hunger for them, as after her corruption, she intended to stop her brother Icthlorin from ferrying the souls of the dead to the afterlife. In fact, she used soul devourers, which are also in servitude to Oreb the Magister, who resides in the Sophanim Slayer dungeon. I have published videos about how Zaltok is the source of necromancy, akin to how the Elder Gods are the source of anima. This is a powerful force called Shadow Anima, and sometimes various other names that we use to perform necromancy. We know that Black Stone can corrupt anima, turning it into shadow, as in the case with Bilrak in the Requiem for a Dragon quest, where he feeds off the energy that the Black Stone inside of Vorkath created. We also know from Zeros that souls are just simply woven anima that hold our identity. This greatly implies that this Black Stone corrupts, creating energy for this great beast Zaltok to feed off of, hence why it would corrupt Amascut as well as all these other beings, and task her with gathering souls through the use of the Slayer skill, which the Black Mask makes you better at. But I have another interesting piece of evidence that Zaltok hungers for your soul. The first time I ever heard the name Zaltok was in Nomad's Elegy. Quote, "Do you really think you can save them, player? You can't. There is a grinding darkness against which your soul shall be lathed, and this is Zaltok." Death even tells us in the Requiem for a Dragon quest that when Rasael was immortal, he researched ways to cleanse corrupted souls, and he has a dream of being smothered by Black Stone hands. You cannot tell me that these are not connected. During this quest, you even create an item to cleanse Vorkath's soul of the Black Stone. The reason that it would corrupt Amascut, though, is instead of appearing itself is, well, that's what it does. Zaltok is most likely never going to appear in Runescape. It's just way too strong. It's written as like a Cthulhuian entity that would just completely wipe out reality if it was here. But its game plan is to set anchors in place to bring itself here. It corrupts and seeps and commands generals who wish to anchor it to our reality and bring it through the veil as seen with the ambassador, the Obsidian Tribunal. The Obsidian Tribunal is a group of devotees of Zaltok that essentially worship its name of Tezcathla. They consist of many different species and races residing on various tomb worlds. In fact, they kidnapped Saradomin's daughter in Sliskay's endgame, and Nex goes and reclaims her. Later on, they end up acquiring Zemorgal's Black Stone that he uses for necromancy, that Azanadra confirms is what, or is at least similar to what corrupted Ma, the Elder God, which is where Amascut was corrupted. They use one of these stones on the monolith. They give it to Guildmaster Tony. He goes up to the monolith and he uses it on it. Well, when he does, it sucks him into Erebus, which is presumably where Zaltok resides, considering the ambassador, his general, summons portals from Erebus, and Raksha, who is also empowered by him, threatens to drag you into Erebus. To back up this connection further, I even unlocked the Devourer's aura from the Sanctum of Rebirth, and I went to the monolith and noticed that they are the exact same color, identical to a T. And this isn't a coincidence in my opinion, especially with all the other stuff I just shared with you. But what if I told you there was a lore book where it literally says, "What carves its hate upon the monolith?" Zaltak. So I think we have pretty conclusive evidence that the source of Amascut's corruption is the Hundred-Handed One. But why is Amascut back with the Sanctum of Rebirth, and what is her end goal of gathering all of these souls? Let's actually dive into the 3 bosses inside of it, how they connect to Amascut, and ultimately how they connect to their master, Zaltak, as well as several other mysterious beings that I've alluded to in the past and I believe are referenced in the lore of the Sanctum. After doing the quest, the first boss that you will encounter in the Sanctum of Rebirth is Vermix. Vermix is a worm, which is a species which shares some similarities with dragons and could potentially have been even created by the dragonkin as dragons were. If you didn't know, dragons were actually created from a combination of their own DNA and the DNA of Raksha, the Shadow Colossus. So it's interesting to note the connection with Zaltak earlier, but what's more interesting is that the dragonkin were known for experimentation and finding these massive beasts all around the universe, and probably in the prior universe as the dragonkin predate the current one. And they would take their genetics and splice it and try to make themselves stronger or to create servants that were stronger, etc. Anyway, in the Requiem for a Dragon quest, we find out that Zorgoth had experimented on Vorkath, and this is going to be a prequel quest to the Ode to the Devourer quest that's coming out. And it's interesting to note, in this quest we get a lore book called the Shadow Realm, and in it there is a creature that is referred to as a worm. And ironically enough, if you go and look at this creature, it looks very similar to Vermix. This creature is a Shadow Leviathan. It is referred to as a great worm large enough to coil around worlds and with a hatred for the living. And this book was found directly on the shelf with Zorgoth's book, Zorgoth's Journal, where he talks about using Blackstone to corrupt Vorkath. This is not a coincidence, and this is a boss in the Sanctum of Rebirth, which is featured in the next quest after Requiem. It is my belief that Zorgoth may have created the worm race from some Shadow Leviathan DNA. In the newly released mining lore that you get in Cam Dozel, it tells you that there is a great worm that died in the northern part of the continent called Jormungandr, and that the Fremennik dug it up, and this is how Bainite ore came into existence. I believe that Ungeal is a dead Shadow Leviathan, or at least part of it, and on this island Zorgoth found some of this Bainite, as it talks about a Shadow Leviathan literally on the same shelf as Zorgoth's journal. I believe he figured out what it was and used it to create something greater, as he alludes to. This could potentially be Galvik, which is featured on Old School, which is essentially a more deadly version of what Vorkath was intended to be. So I'm really curious if we end up getting Galvik. Let me know down below in the comments section if you would like to see Galvik come from Old School RuneScape to RS3. Now, the next boss in the dungeon is Kezalam, the Wanderer. Now, it's interesting to note that in Kezalam's description, it talks about her being genetically modified, and this is really weird because for all we know, dark beasts are just a normal beast that, comes from wherever, but this really alludes to a lot of different things, because I had overlooked it in the past, but I believe dark beasts to be from Erebus. And I won't recover all of the Shadow and Erebus connections, but they definitely fit the bill, as other creatures like Chthonian demons are from Erebus. It's heavily implied Glaciors are from Erebus, and now you have dark beasts, which could potentially also be from Erebus. So it'd make a lot of sense that it would have and share some underworld themes and be here with Amascut. Now, we also know in the Shadow Reef lore that we covered extensively earlier that the ambassador talks about, I will gather the lost and the abandoned. Now, this is a trope that Zaltak typically uses to attract its followers. It promises them a home, it promises them salvation, but in turn provides damnation. But the final boss in the Sanctum is by far the most interesting, and that is Nakatra, the Devourer Eternal. Nakatra was once just an ordinary human and was eventually granted immense power by Amascut herself after the death of two Meccan, and was one of the founding members of the Order of Slayer Masters. Nakatra wields two powerful artifacts which you can obtain as a drop from normal and hard mode, the Roar of Awakening and the Ode to Deceit, said to have been made from a rare desert beetle. Nakatra's main objective is to recruit Slayer Masters all over RuneScape to her cause of gathering souls of various beasts through the Slayer skill. She even travels to Karamja at some point and recruits the Slayer Master Lapalok to her cause. She is the commander of the Soul Devourers in the Sanctum, also known as the Ak. These beasts are bound to her will, similarly to the way Zorgoth describes the whites made from black stone and can be created from many different living creatures, but it also shares similarities to some creatures described elsewhere. In the lore book Death and Devourers, the author goes through and asks several important questions like, if these soul devourers are real, where do they come from, and why do they serve Amascut? Does she have them ensnared? Well, this is strikingly similar to the way beings from the Shadow Realm operate, as in the Shadow Realm lore book obtained in the Requiem for a Dragon quest, which again is required for the Ode to the Devourer quest, so there's a direct link right there. Just as the Abyss and the Void hold their own forms of life, so too does the Shadow, and such beings can be found occasionally in these shadow seas, far from a world's surface. They are twisted and elusive creatures, more formless than definite. They are suffused utterly with shadow anima, composed, I believe, of the same matter as the sea they swim in. Within their realm, they are quite invisible from beyond it, and when brought forth into real space, they expire rapidly. This goes back to the concept of a phantom, which we have access to, or at least are going to have access to with the fourth conjure. Phantoms are essentially manifestations of will, and it seems like the Ak fall within this category, and it'll be interesting to see if they differ at all from the Shadow Realm creatures, but right now it looks like they're virtually cousins. Especially if we do get a hard confirmation that Amascut is corrupted by black stone. It's also worth noting that the Soul Devourers actually have a Slayer boss, Oreb the Magister, who we mentioned earlier, who literally shows up to help the ambassador summon Zaltak. This is a pretty clear-cut connection to Blackstone, as even in some of the lore books, Oreb ponders Blackstone and its ability to warp Cranon's soul into the ambassador. So it definitely seems like the Soul Devourers draw their energy from this black stone, or it is at least used in their creation in some way or another. Once again, we find out in Requiem for a Dragon that they used the black stone to create shadow energy to feed off of, at least Bilrak and the Phantom Vengeance do, and simply put, these phantoms are manifestations of once living beings, similarly to Hermod or even the Black Hands that so often accompany Zaltak in the presence of enough shadow energy. There may even be ideals expressed as phantoms. Since Hermod is the spirit of war, who knows, the Black Hands of Zaltak could literally be a manifestation of horror. It's even hinted in the 2018 Halloween event when Black Hands under Demonheim bring Moya's father Lucian back from the dead, that she is a manifestation of her fear. It's also hinted heavily that Moya is the cause of Bilrak's resurrection as well. But back to the corruption of anima. If they are trying to create a ton of this shadow energy, are there any examples of it currently in the lore aside from the ritual at ED3? Well, yes. In fact, at the Temple of Amanishi, the Anima Titan and Wushanko Guardian Siryu is having its anima turned into shadow by encasing it in black stone shackles. In the new Demonheim lore, we even get a hint that Bilrak, who is feeding off of the Blackstone energy in Requiem, may not even be the real Bilrak that we know and love, and perhaps could be some horror from another reality wearing a Bilrak meat suit. All of this points to the intention that Amascut is certainly corrupted by Zaltok and looking for a way to bring her master into our reality. We know that Zaltok is often called the gaping maw of eternity, and a maw is a mouth, which shares very striking similarities to the word devourer, since you devour items with your mouth. Especially if you go to Chinese buffet. I absolutely love Chinese buffet. I made some Demonheim connections with Zaltok, Moya, and Amascut, but wouldn't it be weird if there was literally a creature inside of Demonheim called a Hope Devourer? Well, there is, and guess what? There's even some lore books about how Bilrak feeds off of its energy. Huh, what are the odds of that? But moving on, we also know that we are getting the skilling boss, the Gates of Elidnus, and there is very little known about Elidnus other than she is Amascut's mother and had a hand in her creation. We also know that she may represent the spirit of water, that water is her element, a cleansing element, if you will. Now, in the teaser for the new Gates of Elidnus skilling boss, we see that the moon is front and center and seems to be important lore-wise to whatever is happening, and I believe I know why. Because of all the connections that I already pointed out between the Blackstone storyline and the Amascut storyline, let's take a look a little bit at something that directly connects them. In the new lore of Sanctum, we find out that Guthix physically created the underworld of Runescape, and this is incredibly interesting because during the Requiem quest, we go to the Guthix Memorial, where it talks about a being that Guthix fought named Myrrh. I hypothesized in a different video that Myrrh is a shadow Leviathan, so I won't hold you up here, but long story short, when Guthix encountered what he called an interdimensional predator, he sought to destroy it, but in doing so, he ended up destroying the planet of which it was hosting. It says later on, though, there are countless husks of dead worlds, and what interdimensional predator could have caused this? It even refers to this force as a devouring corruption. Huh, that sounds oddly familiar, huh? The point I wanted to make, though, about the Nexus is Nexuses and RuneScapes are portal pathways, and it goes on to describe that this being could still be lurking in the folds between worlds, and it is my personal opinion that when Guthix fell to RuneScape, he corrupted the Nexus of the Moon. And I believe Elidnus tasked herself with cleansing this corruption. As the goddess of water, fertility, it would honestly be the most fitting being to cleanse corruption aside from Guthix himself. So what do you think is Elidnus' role in all of this? Let me know down in the comments section. We really have very little to go on with her, but I am super excited to find out about the Gates of Elidnus, RuneScape's newest skilling boss. I wanted to save the craziest lore that was released with the Sanctum for last. We actually find out that Guthix created the RuneScape underworld, and with the Sanctum there's a peculiar text that describes the necromantic elements as beings. Now, over a year ago, I released a video where I hypothesized that the necromancy altars represented the gods in the Moanu journals. We talked about Tezcatlipoca earlier, but I specifically want to talk about the god that represents bones. In the new lore from the Sanctum, it talks about the Lord of Bones being created, and in the Moanu journals, there's a Lord of Bones named Nyarla Hydra. It's really quite likely that these are the same being, due to the creatures being so close to Menephos, them wearing black masks that make you a better slayer, them having a god of bones, worshipping a chief deity who commands them to shed blood, Tezcatlipoca for the Moanu and Amascut for the Menephites, and it would be very unlikely that these two beings are not one and the same in my opinion. Of course, unless each planet has its own underworld, which would be quite interesting, but perhaps a point for another video. I had so much fun diving into the Sanctum lore with you today, and make sure you leave me a like if you did enjoy today's video. But adventurer, I do have one simple question left for you. Do you really think you can save them?